What if the darkest secrets of the Nazi regime weren't locked in vaults, but buried, erased, and whispered about only in fear? We're not talking about war crimes or battlefield atrocities. These are the experiments so twisted, so disturbing, that even the SS tried to wipe them from existence. From occult resurrection to human puppets controlled by wires, these stories cross into pure nightmare. These are the 5 Nazi experiments you were never meant to know. In the heart of the dense and shadowy Black Forest, where the trees grow so thick they blot out the sun, whispers still float through the branches, unexplained, uncanny, and chilling. Locals speak in hushed tones about an SS facility long lost to time, once codenamed Die Still Zell, or the Silent Cell. It was here, they say, that Nazi scientists launched one of their most bizarre and horrifying experiments under a secret program called the Silence Protocol. The goal was not to cure, protect, or understand, but to unmake the essence of being human. Heinrich Müller, a high-ranking Gestapo official, allegedly greenlit the operation after a series of failed attempts to create more efficient covert assassins. Intelligence officers had concluded that psychological instability and vocalized trauma often ruined their missions. The Nazi leadership wanted killers who could operate in silence, resist interrogation, and feel nothing, not even the weight of their own actions. A compound was built underground, beneath what was labeled as a forestry outpost. Prisoners, mainly Soviet POWs and resistance members, were trucked in blindfolded. Few knew what happened once the heavy steel doors closed behind them, but some documents and fragments of journal entries were recovered decades later. They painted a grotesque picture. The Silence Protocol had 3 primary phases. The first was called Reinigung, cleansing. Subjects were stripped of names, numbers, language, and all previous identity. They were isolated in soundproof white rooms for weeks at a time. Food was administered through silent mechanical trays. Any attempt to speak was met with a punishment, high-pitched auditory pulses or worse, injections that induced short-term paralysis. The second phase was Abtrennung, severance. Doctors conducted partial lobotomies targeting areas of the brain linked to speech, fear response, and emotional memory. The goal was to erase the connection between language and meaning. After surgery, many subjects wandered the hallways mute, wide-eyed, and twitching. Nurses referred to them as the ghosts. Those who resisted were taken into what was known as the Schwarzhalle, the Black Hall. No records explain what happened inside. It said only silence ever emerged from that chamber. The third and final phase was Anpassung, adaptation. Surviving subjects were retrained through a bizarre system of silent mimicry. They were shown how to kill with knives, garrotes, and bare hands, all under strobing red lights and complete auditory deprivation. Their trainers communicated through flashing symbols, never using words. A few successful operatives were reportedly deployed in enemy territory, but their fates remain unknown. British and Soviet files mention sudden, silent assassinations in Prague and Warsaw where the killer left no trace, no prints, not even a breath. But something went wrong. Survivors of the facility, mainly former guards, reported a change in the subjects. As they spent more time in silence, something primal seemed to awaken within them. Their eyes lost recognition of friend or foe. They stopped responding to commands, even visual ones. Eventually, they began turning on the staff. In one chilling incident noted in a recovered log, a guard found a senior doctor with his tongue removed and SHHH carved into his chest with a scalpel. No alarms were triggered. No one heard a sound. Panic spread. Müller ordered the facility to be sealed, all subjects terminated. But by then, it was too late. Records show a failed communication attempt with Berlin in January 1945, the final message reading only, "They no longer need to speak. They no longer obey." When American forces pushed into the region later that year, they never found the facility. They found only collapsed terrain where a hillside had caved in, perhaps deliberately triggered. For decades, the site was believed to be lost until hikers in the early 1990s discovered a reinforced door, rusted shut and half buried by moss. What lay behind it remains a mystery. German authorities sealed the area and issued no statements. However, Strange accounts have emerged over the years. Nearby villagers claim to hear footsteps at night, pacing through the trees. Some report hearing whispers with no source. One hunter swore he saw a pale, naked figure in the woods, silent, unmoving, staring. When he called out, it vanished. Search dogs refused to enter the southern stretch of the forest, whimpering and retreating. No one knows if any of the ghosts survived. But if they did, they carry no language, no fear, no memory. Only silence, sharpened into something far more dangerous than any weapon. In the brutal winter of 1944, buried beneath a forgotten stretch of frozen soil near Lublin, Poland, the Nazis operated a facility so secretive it did not appear on any map, not even those used by the SS. Codenamed Operation Thanatos, the installation was run by the Ahnenerbe, the Nazi occult science division, and helmed by Dr. Elias Vogel, a once-renowned cardiologist turned war criminal. His obsession, to conquer death. The mission was chilling in its simplicity. If the Nazis could find a way to die and come back, reliably, repeatedly, without losing the mind, they could create soldiers who felt no fear, no pain, and no limit. Human weapons who could return from the grave, again and again. The bunker was disguised as a standard POW medical station. However, inside, it was a house of horrors. Steel tables lined the walls. Fluids dripped from rusting IVs. Blood never dried on the stone floor because it was washed daily with ice-cold saline to keep the room sterile. Prisoners, mostly political captives and defectors, were selected for their perceived mental resilience. They were told they were part of a survival study for extreme conditions. In truth, they were guinea pigs in the darkest experiment the Reich ever conducted. Vogel's method was based on a blend of legitimate medical science and twisted speculation. First, he would induce clinical death, stopping the heart either through an injection of potassium chloride, immersion in ice water, or sometimes asphyxiation. Then, after 3 to 5 minutes, the subjects would be jolted back to life using crude defibrillators and stimulant cocktails. The process was repeated, sometimes dozens of times, on the same subject. One recovered journal entry describes a man who was killed and resuscitated 23 times over the span of 2 weeks. The theory was that each time a subject came back, their soul, or what Vogel believed to be the soul, would weaken, becoming more detached. With every death, he believed he was thinning the veil between life and whatever lay beyond. He kept meticulous notes on the changes. One entry read, "Subject 12 no longer responds to his own name. His eyes track light but not sound. When asked if he remembers his mother, he replies, 'She never lived. Only fire remains.'" Some experiments introduced new methods. A gas chamber filled with a precise mix of carbon monoxide and hallucinogens was used to simulate spiritual death. One subject, according to Vogel, screamed for 13 minutes after being revived, then began drawing strange symbols on the walls with his fingernails, symbols that matched ancient burial rites from Mesopotamian cultures. Vogel grew convinced he had tapped into an ancestral death memory. Many of the revived subjects were permanently changed. They became catatonic or extremely violent. One, referred to only as K, attempted to chew through his own wrist during his 4th revival. Another, Friedrich, began speaking in a language no one recognized, possibly a corrupted form of Latin. During one night in February, a total blackout struck the facility. When power was restored, 2 guards and 1 nurse had vanished. Friedrich was found standing over a pile of blood-stained uniforms, his pulse steady, eyes wide open, but utterly vacant. The experiments took a toll on Vogel too. His writing became more erratic. He stopped referring to the test subjects by name or number, instead calling them the echoes. He believed they no longer belonged to this world. One entry from his personal diary read, "The body is a doorway, the heart, a key. But the soul has rules I do not understand. Not yet." One of the final recorded experiments involved prolonged death, keeping a subject clinically dead for over 40 minutes before revival. Against all odds, the subject gasped back to life. He vomited black bile, lost all hair, and spoke no words. He simply pointed to Vogel, then to the ceiling, then placed his fingers over his lips, signaling silence. That same night, a fire broke out in the east wing of the compound. Some believe it was sabotage. Others say it was the result of a failed passage, Vogel's term for experiments that went beyond the threshold of life and failed to return properly. Most of the facility was consumed by flame or buried by ice when the fire caused part of the ceiling to collapse. By the time the Soviet Red Army discovered the location, only ashes and half a dozen bodies remained. Vogel was not among them. All documents regarding Operation Thanatos were sealed by Soviet intelligence and buried in the archives of the KGB. Yet, stories persist. In 1968, Polish coal miners drilling near the Lublin site uncovered a hollow cavity. Inside was a sealed, reinforced steel door and a rusted plaque bearing the words, "Nicht öffnen, sie schlafen." Do not open, they sleep. The door was resealed without investigation. The miners were reassigned, and the story was never made public. To this day, no one knows what truly happened during Operation Thanatos. But if Vogel was right, if death really could be manipulated, then perhaps some of his echoes are still lingering, not quite alive, not quite gone, waiting in the dark for someone foolish enough to knock. In the waning months of World War II, while most of Europe burned under bombings and bloodshed, a quiet horror unfolded beneath the streets of Munich, a horror so meticulously hidden that its full scope was never acknowledged in post-war tribunals. It began in 1944, in a Bavarian orphanage known only as Haus Edelweiss. To anyone passing by, Haus Edelweiss appeared normal, even serene. The building was a pristine three-story stone manor surrounded by iron gates and flower gardens. It housed war orphans, children abandoned, displaced, or born of forbidden liaisons between German women and foreign laborers. What no one knew was that beneath the structure, an expansive underground laboratory had been constructed, what survivors would one day call the Echo Cellar. The project was overseen by Dr. Clara Reimann, a pediatric psychologist with disturbing views on language and identity. Reimann believed that empathy, morality, and even consciousness were products of language acquisition, and that if language were stripped away, what remained would be the purest, most primal form of the human being. She proposed a radical experiment to the SS Science Division, to raise children in total silence from birth to adolescence. No speech, no singing, no names, no verbal interaction at all. The children would be watched and fed, but never spoken to. She believed this would answer a question ancient philosophers had pondered for centuries. Was language inherent, or was it the only thing separating man from beast? 28 infants were selected from various parts of Germany and occupied territories. Some were born to Jewish prisoners in secret, others were taken from Romani families or mothers deemed racially impure. All were erased from official records, their identities removed, their fates sealed. The children were raised in sealed, soundproof chambers deep below the orphanage. Each room had one-way mirrors, dim lighting, and walls padded with thick leather to prevent echoes. Caregivers wore masks and used gestures only, no sound, ever. Meals were delivered via silent pneumatic tubes. Diapers were changed quickly and without eye contact. As the children grew, cameras captured every movement. Reimann kept detailed notes on their behaviors. By age 2, most had developed strange coping mechanisms. They hummed without vocal tone, made rapid hand flutters, or sat motionless for hours. Some bashed their heads gently against walls as if trying to hear something, anything. Others stared endlessly into corners, their eyes twitching as if following invisible patterns. They were not feral, but neither were they human in any traditional sense. Reimann's journals, found years later in a flooded archive, describe a chilling transformation. By age 4, subject number 12 stares directly at mirrors for hours. He does not respond to facial gestures but mimics the blinking of the researcher precisely. Subject number 7 has begun arranging food into geometric patterns before eating. No sounds are heard except soft tapping, often rhythmic, as if communicating with something beneath the floor. By age 6, several children had developed their own form of communication. But it was not language in any recognizable form. It involved facial twitches, synchronized blinking, and slow, methodical pointing. Two subjects were seen mirroring each other's actions from separate rooms with uncanny precision, even when visual contact was impossible. Some of the scientists began referring to this phenomenon as silent sync. Then came the first death. Subject number 19 was found with his neck broken, but there was no sign of struggle. No blood. No signs of panic. Surveillance footage from that night was corrupted. What little could be salvaged showed only static and shadows moving behind glass. Afterward, the behavior of the other children changed. They no longer made patterns with food. They no longer blinked at the cameras. Instead, they stood still for long stretches of time, often in corners, facing the walls. The youngest began drawing on their skin with their own waste, spirals, triangles, lines that resembled ancient runes or forgotten alphabets. The SS grew impatient. They demanded results, proof of Riemann's theory. She argued that the children had begun evolving their own method of communication and even hinted that they had accessed a deeper state of consciousness. But one day in March 1945, the echo cellar went silent. A fire alarm sounded from above, and when the staff descended to check the children, they found many of the chambers empty. 14 children had vanished. No trace. No signs of escape, no bodies. Just wide-open doors and faint scratches on the inside of the glass, as if someone, or something, had opened them from the outside. Only 3 children remained. One boy was found sitting in the corner, eyes blackened with bruises, drawing a spiral into the concrete with a rusted spoon. The other 2, twin girls, were discovered curled together, clutching each other, blinking in perfect unison. None of them spoke. Not then. Not ever. Psychologists attempted every known method to break their silence, but nothing worked. They did not scream, cry, or even resist. They simply stared, watched, blinked, and waited. Riemann vanished shortly before Allied troops reached Munich. Her fate remains unknown. The orphanage was burned to the ground during a chaotic retreat. No bodies were recovered. The surviving children were placed in psychiatric care in France, under assumed names. They were studied for years. In 1961, one of the girls hanged herself in her room. No suicide note was found, only a single drawing pinned to the wall, a dark spiral with dozens of small stick figures standing around it, all facing inward. The last known survivor, the boy, was reportedly transferred to a secure Swiss institution in 1974. The doctors there claimed he remained completely mute for decades, until one day, out of nowhere, he whispered a single word to an attending nurse. The word was, "Listen." No other words followed. To this day, no one knows what truly happened in the echo cellar, or where the vanished children went. But some say language is not what separates us from monsters. Sometimes, it's the only thing that holds the monster in. Deep in the snow-laden peaks of the Austrian Alps, near the village of Hallstatt, Nazi occult scientists pursued one of their most disturbing and elusive goals: contact with a race of higher beings they believed predated mankind. These beings, they claimed, possessed infinite energy and perfect knowledge, and were the secret architects of Aryan superiority. To reach them, the Nazis funded a covert project known as Die Vril Wiedergeburt-Versuch, the Vril Resurrection Trials. Rooted in fringe philosophy and pseudoscientific mysticism, the Vril myth was first popularized in the 19th century by the British novel The Coming Race, which described a subterranean people with psychic powers drawn from a mysterious energy source called Vril. While the book was fiction, top Nazi officials like Heinrich Himmler and Karl Maria Willigut took it as prophetic truth. They believed the Vril force was real, and they were determined to harness it. The SS established a mountain fortress known as Bergschatten, the Shadow Castle, and filled it with monks turned scientists, linguists obsessed with dead languages, and women selected for their supposed clairvoyance. But beneath the ceremonial trappings was a darker, experimental arm of the project, run by SS Sturmbannführer Otto Weiss, a failed theologian with a fascination for death and rebirth. Weiss believed that contact with the Vril race required a form of spiritual death, not the end of life, but the destruction of all previous memory and identity. He called it the unbinding. He proposed that if the human mind could be emptied completely, erased of self, it could become a vessel for alien intelligence or Vril possession. To test this, Weiss handpicked 20 volunteers from concentration camps, men and women who were already near psychological collapse from torture and starvation. These individuals were subjected to brutal regimens, sensory deprivation for weeks at a time, starvation punctuated by stimulant injections, and forced exposure to infrasound frequencies that left them vomiting, shaking, and hallucinating. Sleep was withheld for up to 15 days in some cases. During these trials, the test subjects were kept in stone chambers covered with runes derived from Norse and Sumerian alphabets. White-robed guards patrolled the halls, silent and expressionless, enforcing strict silence. The goal was to push the mind past madness into what Weiss called total emptiness. Once a subject reached this state, catatonic, unresponsive, gaze fixed, they were placed into the Vril chamber, a copper-lined vault beneath the castle's lowest level. Inside, they were strapped to reclining stone slabs surrounded by geometrical patterns made of crushed quartz, magnetite, and iron filings. The slabs were arranged in a specific configuration derived from ancient esoteric texts and dowsing rituals believed to align with Earth's energy grids. Weiss then conducted the resurrection ritual. He and his assistants would chant in a blend of Old Norse, Sanskrit, and Enochian, a supposedly angelic language. At the height of the chanting, strobe lights would flash in perfect sync with a device that emitted ELF, extremely low frequency, waves aimed at the base of the subject's skull. This process could last for hours. Many died from cardiac arrest. Those who survived returned, altered. Surviving logs described test subjects waking up with no memory of who they were, yet speaking in languages unknown even to Weiss. One woman, referred to only as Ankh, screamed for 4 hours in perfect Akkadian before collapsing into a coma. Another subject became blind but began painting complex mandalas with charcoal dust, including one image that precisely depicted a double helix, years before DNA was discovered. But the most unsettling account was of Subject 17. After a 7-day ritual, he awoke, sat upright, and smiled. He calmly told Weiss, "I have seen through the iron skin of the world. The ones below are not sleeping. They remember everything." He then gouged out his own eyes. That night, all 4 guards assigned to his cell disappeared. Blood trails were found leading toward the mountains, but no bodies were recovered. Weiss was ecstatic. He believed Subject 17 had made contact. He ramped up the trials, demanding more subjects, more rituals, and more chambers. But within weeks, the castle began to crumble, both physically and mentally. Guards reported hearing voices from walls, chanting that did not match any known language. Several researchers suffered complete mental breakdowns. One scientist was found walking naked in the snow, repeating the phrase, "We are not the first. We are not the last." In March 1945, fearing Allied advance and the collapse of the Reich, Weiss attempted one final mass ritual with 7 subjects at once. He believed it would open a permanent channel between dimensions. The records from that night are fragmented, but what remains is terrifying. Radio operators stationed miles away reported interference, whispers over frequencies that should have been silent. A final log entry from a technician read, "The noise, it's coming from under the earth. Screaming, but reversed." The next morning, Bergschatten was gone. Not destroyed, gone. Where the fortress once stood was a blackened crater, charred and filled with magnetic debris. Not a single body was recovered. No signs of battle. Just silence. Locals avoided the site for decades. Mountaineers who ventured too close complained of dizziness, memory loss, and sudden auditory hallucinations. In 1987, a geophysicist mapping underground caverns picked up inexplicable readings near the ruins, pulse-like vibrations emanating from 300 meters below the surface in perfect intervals. They resembled heartbeat patterns. The Vril resurrection trials were dismissed by historians as myth. But in 2009, a sealed copper cylinder was uncovered during excavation work in Vienna. Inside were notes signed by Otto Weiss, detailing the rituals, diagrams of the chambers, and one final line. "They have taken the vessel. Now the vessel waits. Ravensbrück, the notorious all-female concentration camp located north of Berlin, was remembered by most historians for the brutal conditions and medical horrors inflicted upon its prisoners. What few ever uncovered was the existence of a sub-facility buried under the southern end of the camp, an experimental annex where the line between science and sorcery dissolved completely. It was called Marionettenkammer, the puppet chamber. Operated in secret under the authority of the SS and the Ahnenerbe, the puppet chamber was helmed by Dr. Otto Heiger, a neuropathologist known for his radical theories on involuntary motor control. But as the war raged on and desperation within the Reich deepened, Heiger's ambitions twisted beyond physiology. He became obsessed with the idea of absolute bodily control, not through drugs or surgery, but by directly hijacking the nervous system, turning living humans into puppets of external will. The early trials at Ravensbrück began with crude electrostimulation, electrodes wired to nerve clusters in prisoners' arms and legs, controlled by knobs and dials. A flick of a switch could make a woman's hand clench, a leg spasm, a neck twist sharply to one side. These initial tests served their purpose, but Heiger wanted more. He dreamed of full autonomy, of guiding a human being as effortlessly as one might operate a marionette. To achieve this, he introduced a nightmarish innovation, the thread system. Stolen from obscure research in Romanian mysticism and inspired by Hindu tantric puppetry rituals, the thread system combined thin copper filaments with surgical implantation. The wires, sometimes as fine as a hair, were embedded along the spine and skull base, interwoven with the subject's nervous system. Heiger believed the human body could be rewired, not only to obey remote commands but to lose all sense of personal agency. The surgeries were conducted without anesthesia. Survivors described sensations of being pulled apart from the inside, as if their thoughts were being replaced by static. One woman, designated Subject 041, was said to have performed a ballet routine perfectly, even though she'd never danced before and had compound fractures in both feet. Others weren't so lucky. Some victims seized uncontrollably until their bones shattered. Some screamed without pause for days, their vocal cords shredded, their limbs flailing in unnatural synchronicity. The thread system could simulate movement, but not mercy. The worst experiment was Project Lichtermensch, the Light Man. This final phase of the puppet chamber focused on creating a human being who no longer required independent thought or will. To accomplish this, Heiger combined electrical stimulation with an ancient ritual he had uncovered in a Sanskrit manuscript, involving the invocation of a controlling force, a being or spirit that would inhabit a vacated body. To prepare the subject, Heiger subjected them to total sensory erasure. The eyes were sewn shut, the tongue removed, the ears filled with wax and resin. The body was stripped of every input channel until it was nothing more than flesh waiting to be driven. Then, during the winter solstice of 1944, Heiger performed the ritual on Subject 073, a Polish woman in her early 20s. Her name was unknown. Only her number remained. Witnesses, later interrogated by Soviet investigators, claimed the room grew impossibly cold. The lights dimmed. The copper wires in the thread system began to vibrate, not from electricity but from something deeper, something alive. Subject 073 stood. Not jerked upright, not raised by machinery, but stood under her own power, despite a complete lack of brain activity. Her eyes, sewn shut, wept blood. Her hands twitched in what resembled Morse code. The guards took a step back. Then she spoke. No one knows how. Her vocal cords had been severed. But she said, "Heiger, you are already in the box." Heiger fled the chamber, screaming. 2 guards suffered fatal brain aneurysms within the hour. Subject 073 collapsed and was never revived. Her body vanished during the evacuation of the camp days later. But the message remained. You are already in the box. What did it mean? Later that year, Soviet troops discovered the puppet chamber. Much of it had been destroyed by fire, likely set by retreating Nazis. But hidden in a lead-lined cabinet, they found dozens of reels of 8mm film. The footage, now classified, showed synchronized human movement with impossible precision. 10 women walking in unison despite being shackled at the knees, a man rotating his head 360 degrees without injury, a blindfolded subject dodging objects before they were thrown. But the most disturbing reel had no title. It simply began with a static frame of Dr. Higer, standing in front of a chalkboard filled with anatomical diagrams. Then, the camera pans to a subject suspended by wires. The figure twitches, then moves, and then it looks straight at the camera, through blind, ruined eyes, and smiles. That footage has never been released to the public. As for Higer, he was never captured. Rumors place him in Argentina, Paraguay, and even Tibet. But none were ever confirmed. What is confirmed is that his research notes resurfaced in 1963 during a CIA mind control project called MKUltra. The notes were reportedly burned after analysis. Still, whispers continue, especially in old hospitals in Germany where patients sometimes exhibit unexplained motor anomalies, twitching in sync with others, or speaking in foreign tongues during seizures. One psychiatric nurse in Munich reported a patient who began to draw spirals on her arm with a fork, muttering a phrase no one could translate. A linguist later identified it as an archaic Baltic dialect. The phrase, "Higer is in the box now." What the box is, we may never know. But it may already be open. Every case adds a new layer of mystery, leaving more questions than answers. Which one lingers in your mind, and what's your take on what really happened?